So, you may have seen a couple weeks ago I released a video dissecting some of the main themes that composer Austin Wintory's written over the course of his career in game music, attempting to pin down some of what defines Wintory's style of writing in the context of the main theme of a game. Well, shortly after posting the video, Austin got in touch with me and offered to do a little collaborative follow-up video. Austin Wintory did the score to the Pathless, Giant Squid's follow-up to 2016's Abzu, which came out last week. I wanted to do a little addendum to my video and take a look at how the main theme of the Pathless fits in with my analysis of some of Wintory's other work, as well as take the chance to ask him his thoughts on my thoughts on his work. I mentioned in my other video some similarities between Wintory's themes: slower tempos, minor keys, and simple, clear melodies. The main theme from the Pathless, None Have Returned, is no exception, featuring a slow and simple melody in the key of G minor. The melodies focus on a G minor sound, particularly a G minor pentatonic sound, and the use of the flat 7 as a way to resolve up to the root remind me a lot of Journey's and the Banner Saga's main themes. So, Austin, why do you think you gravitate towards this kind of sound in your thematic writing?
So, first off, I just want to reiterate the comment that I left on your initial video and say thank you for doing that. I was completely caught off guard by that video, and I've had a bunch of people send it to me since who I think all independently know and love your channel. As someone who also was a fan of your analyses, it was very affecting, and I probably learned a few things about myself. We'll get into that, but I just wanted to make abundantly clear how touching that was, that you would consider my work worth that level of scrutiny. So, regarding your specific question, I have two answers for you. First off, I don't really know why I gravitate towards the sounds that I do. Obviously, every composer is an amalgam of the influences that they've picked up through the course of their life, from the music they've listened to and participated in and played in bands, or, played in orchestras or choirs, all that kind of thing. And of course, the life experiences that they've had that affect their way of thinking, their philosophy, etc., etc. And how that all kind of gels together and becomes the foundation from which a composer writes is, in a way, anybody's guess. There's too many variables to try to account for it all. I think in my case, the thing that a lot of the music I've always really admired has in common is that when it comes to thematic material, that kind of underlying DNA that forms the backbone of a larger work, simplicity has always kind of reigned supreme. I try to differentiate between what I call simplistic and simple, where simplistic is kind of condescending in a sense. Simplistic is dumbing things down in one way or another, whereas simple is hopefully eloquent and poetic. It says a lot with very little. And obviously the repertoire both of concert music and classical music and film music and video game music is loaded with examples of things that seem to be pregnant with potential and meaning, while maybe only just being a few notes. That has always been my goal. Any additional trends that you've picked up on beyond that, honestly, is just me, I guess, being me. I'm not really deliberately doing anything consistent, and in fact, my goal is to always push myself somewhere I've never been and escape my sort of native patterns that I might fall back on. In the end, if it's meaningful, if it's something that is singable by someone in a way that they can kind of internalize, then that's usually enough for me. The second thing I wanted to say was that I would be remiss not to humbly suggest you expand the list of the melodies that you were looking at if you were trying to truly draw some trend lines, because I've worked on quite a few projects where the fundamental musical needs really would not have been met by the kind of approach that you are describing when looking at things like the Banner Saga or Journey or Abzu, etc. Just some examples would be a game like Monaco or Tooth and Tail, which were both made by a company called Pocket Watch Games and a creative director, Andy Schatz. Those games are way more rambunctious and crazy, and the thematic material, I think, has a lot less in common with these others. Another one kind of along those lines is a game called Deformers, made by Ready at Dawn, which sadly was almost entirely unplayed by people, but I absolutely loved working on, and was a chance to, again, do something I felt like I had never really done. So yes, I'm sure there are these trends in my writing, and I am doing some things purposefully, but it also really depends on the need of the game, and some of the games that you didn't mention have needs so different from those others that you'll find the themes themselves also very, very different.
That's a totally fair criticism. I think to make a more interesting and cohesive video, I try to spin a clean and coherent narrative or thought process behind a whole tune or soundtrack or composer's body of work. And anything that doesn't fit cleanly into that narrative, it's really easy to just leave out. But even of the small sliver of your work that I did cover in my video, I noticed how distinct each theme feels from each other in spite of their similarities. I chalk this up to the huge variety of approaches to orchestration that you've taken throughout your career, as well as some of the more subtle details in each theme's construction. For the Pathless, the instrumentation is wildly different from any other game score I've ever listened to, and I know that you made some very deliberate choices in instrumentation to achieve this unique effect. Do you intentionally try and keep your scores distinct from one another, or is that just a natural consequence of working on projects that all have completely different styles and goals?
It's actually a little bit of both of those things. Sometimes I make choices just simply to kind of refresh my own personal palette. I remember joking actually at the beginning of the Banner Saga that having just finished Journey, which is very dominated by strings and cello solos and that sort of thing, that I wanted to write for brass and literally only brass to kind of cleanse the palette of strings. Now that wasn't actually serious because I had independent reasons for wanting to do that, but I do tend to move around just out of my own wanderlust. That said, fundamentally, I won't do something unless the game really calls for it or justifies it somehow. Usually it's either narratively or from something intrinsic to the way the characters are written. I just want to make sure that the music is telling their story faithfully and also in a way that feels truly proprietary to that game, that feels like it's actually unique to whatever the developers are trying to achieve.
So then what was it about the Pathless that inspired your approach to the orchestration?
It's tough to summarize that because the Pathless evolved a lot. I worked on it for about 3.5 years, and the score initially was a lot more traditionally orchestral, even though a lot of the folk instruments and unique soloists that are in the final recordings were present in some form or another early on. But that said, fundamentally speaking, I really was just reacting to the story and the world that Matt Nava was creating. Matt's the creative director at Giant Squid and likewise of Abzu, and he had been the art director before that for that game company on Journey and Flower. And so part of it is that he and I have developed a kind of intuitive second hand with each other. I just feel like I get his games, and I think he understands where I'm coming from musically. So to a certain degree, the choices that I make are coming from a kind of almost uncommunicated sixth sense that he and I share. On top of that, this game has this beautiful kind of playable mythology quality, as if you're walking through the lived experience of a hero that later would be immortalized in a constellation and passed down through, oral traditions around campfires. There's something very universal and mythic about the gameplay and about the story being told, and I wanted to make sure that the music had that quality, something rustic and connected to people. The orchestra, for all its splendor and beauty, has a tendency to also feel a bit detached and larger than life. I wanted this to feel more like a folk tradition, and once I kind of clued into that, it just became a matter of experimenting until I ran out of time.
Looking at some of your main themes all side by side, I started to see a common structure emerge. An initial melodic phrase will set up an idea, then the following phrase will take that idea and then move it into a different direction. None Have Returned is structured a little bit differently from the other themes I looked at in my video. You have this initial 2-bar melodic phrase, then you answer it with the following 2-bar phrase that is obviously connected to the first by the rhythm and general contour of the line. The next 4 bars take this idea from the 3rd bar of the theme, this walk up the G minor pentatonic scale in this specific rhythm, and move it down for each of these 3 consecutive single bar phrases. I love the way the 2-bar phrases give way into 1-bar phrases. It feels like the theme is speeding up or building intensity as it goes along. My question for you, Austin, is how much do you think about the structure of a piece of music when writing?
So I want to differentiate structure of a score and structure of a theme. Everything that you just said was really fascinating, but I honestly wouldn't say that I consciously do any of what you just said. I think it's perhaps fair to come up with all of those explanations and analyses after the fact, especially as a sort of impartial observer. Fair game. But I don't think to myself while writing, okay, I want to make sure that there's a parallelism between the first 2 phrases, etc., etc., etc. I was trying to think of an analogy to explain it, and off the cuff, this is imperfect, but what I thought of was, imagine a painter who is setting out to create a landscape. So let's start by making a tree in the center of the image. Well, the development of that tree is going to immediately have implications and consequences for the rest of the piece. So if the tree dominates the center of the canvas and there's a lot of detail and a lot of structure and a lot of color, that's going to influence how the painter then goes about filling in the landscape itself. What's going to be in the sky? Are there going to be other trees, in the distance to maybe help balance the composition? Is it more impressionistic, etc., etc., etc.? All of these considerations where as soon as you put that tree in there, the rest is going to develop in relationship to it. So when I'm writing a theme, often if I find a sort of hook that I like, or even a single interval that feels right, it's now guiding everything that comes after it. So I'm not starting with this top-down series of dictates about how it ought to be. It's just once you crack open a door, everything you do is going to be in subsequent hallways and doorways beyond that initial door. It's really not development of, the floor plan of the building from the bottom up. How was that for like 5 mixed metaphors? But I said I want to differentiate between scores and themes, because when I think about structure of a full score and sort of how a theme will get used and doled out and evolve, that I think about a ton. To me, it's the difference between Beethoven coming up with, ba 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 bum, and crafting those first initial 4 notes to become the basis of the motive, versus exploring how to actually develop that in the subsequent 10-minute movement and fully 4-movement symphony. The latter I absolutely spend a lot of time thinking about.
That is so interesting. If I had to guess, I'd think a very, very small number of composers, if any, take a very analytical approach to their music when writing. But it's really interesting to me to hear people talk about how they balance their kind of inspired, unbridled creative output with a more structured sense of the craft of putting together, a piece of music or something like that. That being said, one thing that the Pathless theme does that I haven't noticed in any of your other themes is repeating notes. The kind of hook of the theme in my mind is this figure right at the beginning with 3 B-flats in a row. And I think these 3 notes are why I find this melody getting stuck in my head a lot. When writing a theme, what specifically are you thinking about when it comes to the musical characteristics that a theme might have?
Honestly, this answer might seem very simple, but I really am just trying to ask myself, how does this make me feel? There is a part of me that is saying, how can I develop this? Is there a hook or recognizable kind of architecture that will allow me to develop this where you can still hear that is the theme as the foundation of the development? In other words, if something was just utterly unmemorable or untraceable, you wouldn't hear it as it starts to evolve. Everything would just sound like new material. You wouldn't differentiate variations on an old idea from the arrival of a new one. So I think about that, but that is rather instinctive, because I basically just develop an idea and then I sing it to myself. I walk around the streets outside my studio for a few days and sometimes hum things to myself a lot and that sort of thing, and I just see, will this hold up? Can I play with it and flip it upside down and vary it and slow it down and speed it up and do all of those things that very often occur in melodic development and still feel like I can trace it? So the repeating note thing versus not, big leaps, wide intervals or not, etc., etc. Honestly, it is just always about what feels right here and now for this project at this time in my life. It's worth mentioning that 5 years from now, I may have a very different sensibility, as we all just constantly evolve.
Austin, thank you so much for doing this. We're going to wrap this up soon, but first I'd love to know a little bit about the process of writing a piece of music and then actually getting it into the game. I think a lot of people out there can write some music and love the idea of writing music for games, but the actual steps in between sitting alone at your piano writing and playing a game with a fully orchestrated and implemented soundtrack, that might seem a little mysterious.
Well, seriously, thank you again. I am just blown away. I get questions a lot about the process, about the techniques. If you go to my YouTube channel, you'll see I like to share a lot of behind the scenes kind of content. We've been doing a series called As Noted, where we share the transcriptions and final conductor scores and things like that of a lot of cues, especially ones that seem to be consistently requested. But to the specific question of the process that a cue can take from literal blank page all the way to the finished product that you would hear in the game, I've actually just put the finishing touches on a video that you can see right now by going to my channel that documents every single step. Every member of my team that I work with on a piece, especially one involving orchestral recordings, I have everybody document their own process, and we show in pretty great detail everything that it takes. So if that's of interest, I hope folks can check it out. But either way, thank you again so much for having me and for, in a way, validating a lifetime of trying to make sense out of music and games and creativity and all that, and hoping that something sensible and meaningful comes out of it.
I've seen the video and it is incredibly interesting. You guys should all definitely go check it out. Now, I hope you'll forgive me for being a little indulgent, but for the last question, I'd love to know, what did you think watching my analysis of your writing? Was there anything I said that surprised you? Where in the video was I totally off base? And was there anything that I touched on that you had deliberately made part of your writing style?
Honestly, I can only just say that the whole thing was kind of surreal. You know, I've been doing this now for the better part of 15 years, and yet I still have this kind of knee-jerk shock when anybody seems to care or pay that much attention to what I'm doing. I just don't take it for granted. I don't feel like I am owed that or deserved that or anything like that. I really just try to do my job, work with these, amazing creative developers and filmmakers and orchestras and theater companies and all that kind of thing that I've been grateful to collaborate with, and just really try to give them all that it is that I have to offer. And sometimes everything that I do is fundamentally instinctual, of course built on, my constant drive to hone my technique and just become a better composer foundationally. But in other words, it sometimes is a purely unintellectual process, and then sometimes it's a very intellectual process where we spend a lot of time thinking about ways in which music can, reflect literary themes, and there might be subtle allusions to, prior works or whatever. It really is just so difficult to summarize. That's part of what I love about this career, is every project is kind of its own little adventure that has its own rules, its own terms for success versus failure, all that kind of thing. And I absolutely love it. I feel insanely grateful to get to do this. So no, there isn't anything actually that I would say is especially wrong, or honestly, especially right. It was a kind of level-headed take on things that are sometimes conscious and sometimes not. I think you did a pretty amazing thing. I can only restate the earlier response that I had, which was that there are a handful of games and even films that if you go, they would probably shake up your formula a little bit because they just had their own rules that I was establishing for them. But that doesn't invalidate the argument that you made, I think. It was interesting. It was, like I said, it was actually more surreal than anything else.
Well, that's all I've got to say for now. Thank you so much, Austin, for agreeing to come and share your thoughts like this. I spend a lot of time trying to get inside composers' heads by looking at their music, and it's not often that I get to actually ask a composer, so what's in your head? So this has been really fun for me. I can't wait to pick up the Pathless, and I'm sure all of you watching feel the same way. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.